All right, me. It is the middle of April. It's like April 16th. It's an hour until Good Friday. I know that much. Um, and I have just finished reading, fittingly enough, I guess, Dan Brown's Angels and Demons. Um, Angels and Demons is the first book within kind of the Robert Langdon series. Um, I don't recall there being a real, as I was looking this up, a real nice like chronology to it, right? It's kind of like the James Bonds of they exist all within the same, and it's all the same character, but it's pretty fluid as to what happens. Really, the only set point is that really Angels and Demons is definitely the first one. Um, so yeah, yeah, um, fascinating book. Um, because it comes out weirdly enough, like I started reading this, and that day, I think it was Eddie Burbank, who was a YouTube person that I watch. Um, I think it was Eddie Burbank at least. Put out a video that was about the resurgence of spy media, especially for children, in the early 2000s. And this was written in 2000 to go along with all of this, and it's a really, I think, fascinating concept of like we knew what was like on the verge of happening, in regards to like the Middle East and things, and where like intelligence was going to be the key factor in all of this. And then all of a sudden, you know, all the media comes out involving around intelligence because that's what we suddenly become interested in again, and espionage and things like that. And then everything in the early 2000s happens. So yeah, yeah. But yeah, Angels and Demons itself. Um, it is fascinating to read a a spy espionage womanizer type book where that character is designed intentionally to be not this super man's man kind of guy, but rather this just academic who ends up getting pulled into this on pure accident. But then is also still a womanizer, which is incredibly weird. Right? It's the whole, male authors try to write about a woman that's not insanely attractive and insanely smart challenge, right? um, because from what I remember, that's kind of what all of Dan Brown's woman characters are, right? Which is in one way is like, yes, we want strong female characters, but also like if that's the only contextualization you can put strong female characters in, is that they are incredibly attractive, and then they are also incredibly smart, and they do all these crazy things that no singular person could ever do, right? Like in this instance of Vittoria, of being really well versed in religion, but also incredibly well versed and a what was her official title was a molecular marine biologist, I think. um, but then also being this super hot yoga instructor, because that's how the book ends, right? It's the oh, have you never had a religious experience before? And I've never thought that I could be someone who had a religious experience. Well, then you've never had sex with a yoga instructor. And then the book ends, right? And it's like, what the fuck? What? For this book that is all about this intense and amazing research, but also this incredibly fascinating story told through the Catholic archives, as well as this story that we hear whisperings of, and we hear vague ideas and conspiracies of, but actually writing it all down is incredibly fascinating, right? And it's really interesting because so much of it is based and rooted in reality that we just don't get to see because it is so under so much lock and key, right? And so it's fascinating, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, and then it gets fucking weird, right? Because the entire setup to this has been that throughout the story, at least, is you're dealing with this issue in which the Catholic Church is fading and dying, but the Illuminati, which in a sense is just a super anti-religious organization, wants to just destroy it once and for all, and they get their hands on effectively an atom bomb. It's an antimatter bomb. That's a whole ordeal. That's, we know what it is. And then they're basically going to just attempt to destroy the Vatican and broadcast it. And by physically destroying the Vatican, they're going to, get rid of religion altogether, right? And so you have that, and then you have this fascinating story, which is like that's kind of the backdrop for all this. And then you have your Harvard professor that is more or less an art professor and deals with symbols, that gets brought in because of the symbols and the branding that's being put onto people that are being murdered as a result of these attacks. And then you have the Carmalango. I kept reading it both ways, but who is like this fascinating character that is very much like a conservative religious zealot in a way, but it's also very fascinating of like, this is a guy who has known nothing but the church and is now dealing with the death of his father figure, the Pope, who does end up being his real father, because that's a whole story in of itself. And right, you're following this really, I think, really interesting story of where you're dealing with concepts of faith and belief and willingness to take those beliefs and leaps of faith and risks simply because you think it is the right thing to do, right? And the argument that gets constantly brought up is, this issue on whether or not science has gone too far past religion, right? And that's not like a, has science gone too far type thing but rather a, can we restrict within ourselves the moralities that we need to withhold certain things and to not explore certain things until we have a better understanding of morality and ourselves and humanity. And the bomb becomes that, right? Is in an attempt to figure out how the Big Bang happened and how matter was created, right? Or how matter was allowed to explode and exist in the way that it does, right? You have the first murder, which all happens pretty much off screen or like off book, but the creation of matter and the creation of a universe and things like that, and that sparks everything, right? And although, yes, right, we have founded this point that is fascinating and incredible and unites what is normally considered and even especially now seen as two opposite things, right? Of religion versus science, right? And viewing those as two opposites, we have now proof that they are one and the same, right? That they are just two different ways of looking at the same concept and notion and existence, right? and we have two people, one who is the head of CERN, who is Kohler, and then one who is the Carlamango, I can't remember which one it is, who are on these diametric opposites, right? One of them is very, very science-based and blames religion for his disabilities, and then you have one who is so religious that he can't look at anything else except in terms of religion, right? And so it all kind of co-ops into this unfolding of a tale, and it's just a fascinating read, right? And interesting and gripping, and it's, I mean, what's the final page count? The final page count is 620, right? 620 pages. And I think it is good for 95% of it, which is really hard to do, right? Especially for a book that is reliant on being a thriller, right? It's very hard to keep any sort of that sort of thrill and suspense for the entire time. And the part that I didn't like is the twisting at the end, right? Of where, as part of the argument for how do we write books and how we write thrillers and how do we write these things, right, is that we feel incessant that we need a twist, or some sort of shock ending, right? And you get like 4 of them back to back to back to back, and it's like, you're cramming this all into the last 80 pages, Dan Brown. We stick with a few of these, not all of them, because you have this whole thing of all of a sudden, right, you're led throughout the entire book in which you're led to believe that the second hand, the second person in charge of the Swiss Guard is like the mole for the Illuminati, and you're kind of like led to believe this throughout the entire time. And I think the book still works if that's the case, right? But then, as it turns out, at the very end, it's actually the Carlamango, whatever it is, who is actually orchestrating all of this from the inside, and he is actually the person who was in charge of the Illuminati, and Illuminati is not actually revived. It just is something that he resurrected for this one thing, and to try and get everyone invested in religion again, and being a part of all of this again, right? And through his actions, right, it's a but then like it all unfoils right at the very end of this. We're not given a lot of leads, I don't think, to really kind of rule that out in an active way. So then it's just like well, okay, I guess that seems like an added twist that we didn't really need, but sure, yeah. Especially when we are led to in such a way to want him to succeed throughout a huge chunk of the book. Also because he gets posed as Jesus, which is another wild thing, right? Because what I think is the better twist is that the Carlamango gets revealed as the son of the previous pope, right? And it ties a lot of things together, in which is like this whole thing about diametric opposites, right? In which the pope, while he was still a priest and still under celibacy, fell in love with a woman who was a nun and was therefore still under celibacy, and through artificial insemination they were able to have a kid together and keep their celibacy, but able to have a child, right? And it turns out that the Carlamango is that child, who then gets adopted by the Pope years later, when the mother unfortunately dies in an incredibly unfortunate terrorist attack, right? And so you have this 33-year-old that is um, that is the son of two virgins, and is basically put into a place in which he resurrects the church, right? In a way that draws all eyes onto it and makes it the focal point again. So yeah, right. It's this really kind of like, he's a Jesus character, which is another one of these fun little twists. You have the twist of, he was already kind of planning on this anyway with the whole helicopter and the whole bit there. And then Robert Langdon ends up jumping on the helicopter with him. So then we have to figure out a way for Robert Langdon to somehow survive, which is another twist. And then, you have the whole twist of this character that we clearly see as very rational in Mortati, but is so rational that he's never going to be elected pope, and is asked to be in charge of all these other special pieces of the conclave. Suddenly gets elected pope. So it's just a huge long ordeal of, a whole bunch of different things, which is all fascinating, all, wild and crazy and everything. But yeah, right. It's a very fun book. It's a very fun read. I read it over a couple different sessions. I read the first probably about 200 to 300 pages. Here, I read another 200 or so while I was running our camp store and didn't have things to do for a while, and then read the last 100 today, right? So because it is so interesting and so fun, right? It doesn't feel like a drag to read, but it's just a matter of keeping track of all these lovely things that are historical artworks, historical pieces of documentation, things like that. Yeah. I guess my final thought on it is that this Dan Brown and the whole Robert Langdon series, at least I think the whole Robert Langdon series, because I'm only really familiar with Angels, Demons, and the Da Vinci Code, is that it goes back to a conversation I've constantly had with one of my coworkers, Grace, which is that like the aestheticism of Catholicism is way more interesting than the actual religion, right? Which is horrible and terrifying to say, right? But it is. We're both in agreement that like the aesthetic nature of the Catholic Church and what it has been able to produce, both in works of literature, works of art, but then also the secrecy and the tradition of it, is way more interesting than its interpretations of biblical nature, biblical studies, right? Which is a wild thing, right? Of where the nature of a religious organization is not necessarily what is through to the religion, but what the religion is associated with, which is wild. But I think it also speaks a lot to our modern concept of what we believe in. So I don't know. That's Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. Fun read, fun book. Yeah.